May 10, 1942. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Tokyo Bay, Japan. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Watanabe stood in the weapons testing facility, staring at the American rifle laid before him on the examination table. Serial number 3749286. An M1 Garand, one of dozens captured just weeks earlier, when 78,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered at Bataan in the largest capitulation in United States military history. The rifle gleamed under the harsh workshop lights. Walnut stock, 8 pounds of American steel and engineering, chambered in .30-06 Springfield. Watanabe had fought American forces across the Pacific for 5 months. He had seen what this weapon could do in the hands of a determined defender. But what he was about to discover in the coming weeks would shake the foundations of Japanese military doctrine and expose a technological gap so vast that his superiors would spend the next 3 years desperately trying to close it. The mathematics were simple and devastating. A trained American soldier with this rifle could fire 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute. A trained Japanese soldier with the standard issue Type 38 or Type 99 Arisaka bolt-action rifle could fire 10 to 15 aimed shots per minute, 3 to 1, sometimes 4 to 1, sometimes 5 to 1. The Americans weren't just winning firefights through superior numbers or better tactics. They were winning through a revolutionary weapon that had fundamentally changed infantry combat, and the Japanese had nothing that could match it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The journey to this moment of reckoning had begun on December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces launched coordinated invasions across the Pacific. The Philippines, a united states, territory, and strategic anchor in the Western Pacific, became a primary objective. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma commanded the Japanese 14th Army, tasked with conquering the islands. On December 10th, Japanese bombers struck Clark Field near Manila, destroying much of the American air power in the Philippines in a single devastating raid. 2 days later, major amphibious landings began at Lingayen Gulf on northern Luzon. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding United States Army forces in the Far East, faced an impossible situation. He had requested 84,500 M1 Garand rifles in autumn 1941 to equip Filipino troops. The War Department denied the request due to production constraints. The Philippine Division, comprised largely of elite Philippine scouts and American regular Army troops, had received some of the new semi-automatic rifles. These units were adequately equipped and well-trained, but the bulk of Filipino forces still carried World War I-era M1903 Springfield rifles, or older M1917 Enfields. The disparity in equipment would prove less significant than Japanese planners anticipated, because the units that did possess the Garand would demonstrate its revolutionary capabilities. MacArthur ordered a fighting withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula on western Luzon. The plan, War Plan Orange 3, had been refined over 2 decades. American and Filipino forces would hold Bataan and the island fortress of Corregidor in Manila Bay, buying time for relief forces from the United States mainland. Those relief forces would never come. By early January 1942, approximately 80,000 American and Filipino troops had consolidated on Bataan. They faced approximately 43,000 Japanese soldiers of the 14th Army. The defenders dug in along a defensive line, stretching across the peninsula's narrow waist. Dense jungle covered the volcanic slopes of Mount Natib and Mount Samat. Mangrove swamps lined the coasts. The terrain favoured defence. The 3rd Battalion, 57th Infantry Regiment, Philippine Scouts, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Philip Fry, received Garand rifles as part of the Philippine Division's modernization. On January 10, 1942, Japanese forces launched a coordinated attack against Fry's positions near Mauban. The Scouts, occupying prepared defensive positions, waited until the Japanese infantry closed to effective range. What happened next shocked the attacking forces. The volume of fire that erupted from the Scout positions seemed impossible from a single battalion. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to facing bolt-action rifles that required manual cycling between shots, believed they were assaulting positions defended by multiple machine gun sections. The distinctive crack of M1 Garands firing in rapid succession echoed across the jungle slopes. Fry later reported to his superiors, "It was a slaughter." The firepower of a battalion armed with modern weapons is something. The Garand rifle is beyond my descriptive powers. The Japanese attack collapsed. Bodies littered the approaches to the scout positions. Survivors withdrew in confusion, reporting that they had faced overwhelming defensive firepower, far exceeding intelligence estimates. This pattern repeated across Bataan during January and early February 1942. Units equipped with Garands consistently repulsed attacks with devastating effectiveness. The semi-automatic capability allowed defenders to maintain continuous fire without breaking their firing positions to manually cycle bolt actions. Soldiers could keep their cheek welds, maintain sight pictures, and fire as rapidly as they could pull the trigger. The pattern was unmistakable. American and Scout units, armed with the new rifle, were inflicting casualties far out of D's, in proportion to their numbers. A single company of Garand-equipped troops could generate firepower equivalent to multiple companies armed with bolt-action rifles. But by late February, the situation on Bataan had deteriorated catastrophically, regardless of superior weaponry. The defenders faced starvation. Rations were cut repeatedly. By March, soldiers received approximately 1,000 calories per day, less than half the required amount for men engaged in combat operations. Malaria ravaged the ranks, dysentery spread through unsanitary conditions, medical supplies dwindled to nothing. Artillery ammunition stocks approached exhaustion. The Japanese implemented a naval blockade that cut off all resupply. MacArthur's promises of relief rang hollow as weeks stretched into months, with no sign of the convoy that would never sail. President Franklin Roosevelt ordered MacArthur evacuated to Australia on March 11th. The general departed by PT boat under cover of darkness, leaving behind 78,000 men with his famous promise, "I shall return." Command passed to Major General Jonathan Wainwright. The situation was hopeless. By early April, the defenders could no longer mount effective resistance. Ammunition was exhausted. Food stocks were gone. The hospital facilities at Cab Cabin overflowed with sick and wounded men who received almost no medical care. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King, commanding the forces on Bataan, surrendered to the Japanese. King acted without authorization from Wainwright, who commanded from Corregidor. King understood that further resistance meant the death of his entire command. 78,000 men laid down their arms in the largest surrender in American military history. Japanese forces moved quickly to secure the captured equipment. Thousands of rifles, millions of rounds of ammunition, vehicles, artillery pieces, medical supplies, and other war materials fell into their hands. Among these, captured weapons were several hundred M1 Garand rifles from the Philippine division units that had fought so effectively during the campaign's early weeks. American survivors attempted to destroy their Garands before capture. Many succeeded, smashing rifle mechanisms with rocks or entrenching tools. But the Japanese recovered dozens of intact examples. Some soldiers later reported seeing Japanese troops examining the captured rifles with obvious interest, handling the weapons carefully, taking notes. The captured Garands were consolidated at supply depots in Manila. Japanese ordnance officers catalogued the weapons, noting their condition, their unique 8-round en-bloc clip system, their gas-operated semi-automatic mechanism. Within weeks, select examples were crated and shipped to Japan for detailed technical analysis. By late May 1942, multiple M1 Garand rifles arrived at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal on Tokyo Bay. Yokosuka, established in 1865, served as one of Japan's primary naval shipyards and weapons development facilities. The arsenal employed thousands of skilled machinists, engineers, and technicians. It housed sophisticated testing laboratories, precision measuring equipment, metallurgical analysis facilities, and production machinery. The Imperial Japanese Navy, not the Army, took primary interest in the captured American rifles. The Navy maintained its own ground combat forces, the Special Naval Landing Forces, elite units that had spearheaded amphibious assaults across the Pacific. These Rikusentai Marines recognized the M1's advantages after fighting American troops on Wake Island, Guam, and throughout the Philippines campaign. Army leadership remained skeptical. The Imperial Japanese Army had tested semi-automatic rifle designs during the 1930s. Between 1932 and 1937, Army Ordnance evaluated multiple prototype designs, including rifles based on the Czechoslovakian ZH-29 and rifles designed by American inventor John Pedersen, who had worked directly with Japanese engineers. These trials produced the Type Hei, Type Ko, and Type Otsu experimental rifles. All failed to meet Army standards. The prototypes were expensive to manufacture. They required precision machining beyond the capabilities of most Japanese arsenals. They experienced reliability problems. The costs per unit exceeded twice the price of standard Arisaka bolt-action rifles. Most critically, when war erupted with China in 1937, the Army cancelled all semi-automatic rifle development to focus resources on conventional weapon production. The Navy, however, maintained greater independence in weapons development. Naval arsenals operated with more autonomy than Army facilities. The Navy could pursue projects the Army deemed impractical, and after 5 months of combat against American forces, Navy leadership understood that Japanese infantry faced a decisive disadvantage in firepower. Lieutenant Commander Watanabe received orders to conduct comprehensive testing and evaluation of the captured M1 rifles. His team included experienced ordnance engineers, metallurgists, and small arms specialists. They would disassemble the rifles completely, measure every component with precision instruments, analyze the steel composition, test the gas system, evaluate the operating mechanism, and most importantly, conduct live fire comparison tests against Japanese service rifles. The Americans had achieved something remarkable. They had created the world's first semi-automatic rifle, adopted as standard issue for an entire military. John Garand, a Canadian-born engineer working at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, had spent 15 years perfecting the design. The rifle entered production in 1936. By December 1941, American factories were producing thousands monthly. The genius of Garand's design lay in its elegant simplicity. A port drilled in a barrel near the muzzle diverted a small amount of propellant gas into a cylinder beneath the barrel. This gas drove a piston rearward. The piston was attached to an operating rod that rotated and unlocked the bolt, extracted the spent cartridge case, ejected it through a port on the right side of the receiver, compressed a spring, and then the spring drove the operating rod forward again, stripping a new round from the clip, chambering it, rotating the bolt to lock, and readying the rifle to fire again. All of this happened in a fraction of a second, automatically, without any action required from the shooter except pulling the trigger. The soldier maintained his firing position. The rifle cycled itself. The only indication that a shot had been fired was the recoil impulse against the shoulder and the empty brass case arcing through the air. Japanese engineers had nothing comparable in service. The Type 38 Arisaka, adopted in 1905, remained the standard infantry rifle for most Japanese forces. Chambered in 6.5mm Arisaka, the rifle was strong, reliable, and accurate. Post-war testing by American Ordnance would prove the Type 38's action was actually stronger than the Springfield or Lee-Enfield actions. The steel quality was excellent. The rifle could handle more powerful cartridges than the relatively mild 6.5mm round it fired, but the Type 38 was a bolt-action rifle. After each shot, the soldier had to lift the bolt handle, Pull the bolt rearward to eject the spent case. Push the bolt forward to chamber a new round. Rotate the bolt handle down to lock, and then reacquire the target before firing again. The entire process required removing the right hand from the pistol grip, breaking the cheek weld, performing the bolt manipulation, and then reassuming the firing position. Even with extensive training, this process consumed valuable seconds. A trained rifleman could fire 10 to 15 aimed shots per minute, perhaps 20 in desperate circumstances for brief periods. The Type 38 held 5 rounds in an internal magazine loaded via stripper clips. Every 5 shots required reloading, which consumed additional time. The Type 99 Arisaka, introduced in 1939 and chambered in 7.7mm Arisaka for improved stopping power, suffered the same limitations. It was a bolt-action design with a 5-round magazine. It featured some improvements over the Type 38, including a chrome-lined bore for easier maintenance and a monopod for prone firing positions, but it still required manual cycling between shots. The rate of fire disadvantage was mathematical and unavoidable. An American rifleman with an M1 Garand could deliver 3 to 4 times as many aimed shots per minute as a Japanese rifleman with an Arisaka. In a sustained firefight, this difference was decisive. Watanabe's team began systematic testing in WWII, late May 1942. They selected multiple captured Garands in varying conditions. Some showed heavy wear from months of combat use. Others appeared almost new, likely captured from supply depots before issue to troops. The engineers cleared a firing range at Yokosuka's test facility. They prepared chronographs to measure muzzle velocity, targets to assess accuracy, and observation equipment to document the rifle's operation. The first test firing occurred on May 28, 1942. An experienced Navy marksman, Petty Officer First Class Saburo Nakamura, chambered the rifle using an 8-round en-bloc clip. The distinctive metal clip held 830-06 cartridges in a single unit. The shooter pressed the clip down into the magazine through the top of the receiver. The bolt automatically closed, chambering the first round. The rifle was ready to fire. Nakamura assumed a prone position at 100 meters from the target. He acquired the sight picture. Through the M1's aperture rear sight and post-front sight, he pressed the trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack. The recoil pushed straight back into his shoulder. The operating rod cycled. The empty brass ejected. The next round chambered. The rifle was ready to fire again. Nakamura fired a second shot, then a third, then a fourth. He fired all 8 rounds in rapid succession, maintaining his firing position throughout. The entire string took approximately 12 seconds. When the 8th and final round fired, the empty en-bloc clip automatically ejected from the receiver with a distinctive metallic ping. The bolt locked open on the empty magazine. Nakamura inserted a fresh clip, released the bolt, and fired 8 more rounds, then 8 more. In 60 seconds, he fired 32 rounds. Every shot struck the target area. The rifle never malfunctioned. It cycled smoothly despite being a captured weapon that had likely fired thousands of rounds in combat. The Japanese. Observers made careful notes. They measured the time between shots. They calculated the rate of fire. They examined the ejected brass cases, noting that they showed no signs of excessive pressure or extraction problems. They inspected the rifle's chamber and bore after firing. Both showed normal wear patterns. For comparison, they conducted the same test with a Type 99 Arisaka. Nakamura, an expert marksman equally proficient with both weapons, assumed the same prone position at 100 meters. He loaded the Arisaka's 5-round magazine with 7.7mm cartridges using a stripper clip. He acquired the sight picture. He fired. The Arisaka's report was slightly different from the Garand's, a deeper boom from the heavier cartridge. Nakamura worked the bolt. He lifted the handle, pulled it back smartly, pushed it forward, rotated it down. He reacquired his sight picture. He fired again. He worked the bolt again. He fired a third shot, 4th, 5th. After 5 rounds, the magazine was empty. Nakamura removed his right hand from the pistol grip. He reached for another stripper clip. He inserted it into the clip guide atop the receiver. He pressed the 5 cartridges down into the magazine with his thumb. He removed the empty stripper clip. He closed the bolt. He reassumed his firing position. He reacquired the sight picture. He fired. In 60 seconds, Nakamura fired 14 rounds from the Arisaka. He required multiple reloading pauses. He had to break his firing position repeatedly to work the bolt. His rate of sustained fire was less than half what he achieved with the Garand. The numbers spoke for themselves. The M1 Garand could deliver more than twice as many rounds on target in the same time period. In a combat environment, this difference meant American soldiers could suppress enemy positions more effectively, respond to threats more quickly, and maintain overwhelming firepower advantages during firefights. Watanabe documented the results meticulously. He calculated that 10 American soldiers armed with Garands could fire approximately 450 aimed shots per minute collectively. 10 Japanese soldiers armed with Arisakas could fire approximately 120 shots per minute. The Americans enjoyed a nearly 4-to-1 advantage in volume of fire, but volume alone didn't tell the complete story. The Garand's semi-automatic operation meant American soldiers maintained better accuracy throughout sustained engagements. They never broke their firing positions. They never lost their sight pictures. They never removed their hands from the trigger or grip. The rifle cycled itself, while the soldier focused solely on aiming and firing. Japanese soldiers with bolt-action rifles had to disrupt their aim repeatedly. Working the bolt required removing the strong hand from the grip and trigger. Reloading required even more extensive movement. Each disruption degraded accuracy. Each pause allowed enemy forces to maneuver or return fire. The psychological advantage was equally significant. American soldiers armed with Garands could maintain continuous suppressive fire. Enemy forces facing this volume of fire stayed pinned in cover. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't advance. They couldn't effectively return fire. The semi-automatic rifle transformed American infantry squads into mobile fire support platforms. Japanese forces at Bataan had experienced this reality firsthand. Attack after attack had faltered under the devastating firepower delivered by relatively small numbers of defenders. What Japanese commanders had initially attributed to superior defensive positions or excellent marksmanship was actually the result of a revolutionary weapon that had changed the fundamental calculus of infantry combat. Watanabe's team continued testing throughout June and July 1942. They disassembled multiple Garands completely, laying out every component for detailed examination. They measured each part with precision micrometers. They analyzed the steel composition using spectroscopic analysis. They studied the gas system's design. They examined the rotating bolt's locking lugs. They evaluated the trigger mechanism. The engineering was sophisticated but not exotic. Garand had used proven materials and manufacturing techniques. The steel alloys were good quality but not exceptional. The tolerances were tight but achievable with proper machining equipment. The heat treatment processes were standard. Nothing about the rifle's construction was beyond Japanese capabilities. What impressed the engineers most was Garand's elegant solution to the gas system. The gas port location, the piston design, the operating rod's cam arrangement that rotated and unlocked the bolt, all worked in perfect harmony. The system was self-cleaning to some degree. Carbon fouling that accumulated during firing was blown out by subsequent gas operation. The rifle could fire thousands of rounds between cleanings. The clip system presented both advantages and challenges. The 8-round N-block clip allowed fast reloading. A soldier simply pressed the loaded clip down into the receiver. No fumbling with loose rounds, no careful feeding of cartridges. One smooth motion, and the rifle held 8 rounds, ready to fire. When empty, the clip automatically ejected, and the bolt locked open, providing a clear visual and tactile indication that the magazine was empty. However, the clip system also created logistical requirements. Each rifle needed N-block clips. Soldiers had to carry loaded clips into combat. Manufacturing the clips required dedicated production facilities. Lost clips couldn't be easily replaced in the field. Japanese engineers recognized immediately that adapting the Garand to Japanese service would require modifications. The 30-06 cartridge was longer than Japanese service rounds. The unblock clip was designed specifically for 30-06. Dimensions. Japanese 7.7mm Arisaka ammunition wouldn't work with the American clips. In July 1942, Yokosuka engineers attempted to rechamber a captured Garand to fire 7.7mm Arisaka ammunition. They removed the barrel and installed a new barrel, bored and chambered for the Japanese cartridge. They modified the bolt face to accommodate the different rim dimensions. They adjusted the gas port size. The rifle fired. The gas system cycled the action. Extraction and ejection functioned properly. The rotating bolt locked and unlocked correctly. The basic mechanical operation proved compatible with Japanese ammunition, but the unblock clip system failed catastrophically. The Japanese 7.7mm cartridge, while similar in diameter to 30-06, had different case dimensions and overall length. The American clips couldn't grip the Japanese cartridges reliably. Rounds shifted during recoil. Feeding became erratic. Malfunctions occurred frequently. The engineers tried multiple solutions. They attempted to modify existing N-block clips. They experimented with redesigned clip geometry. They tested different spring tensions. Nothing worked consistently. The en-bloc clip system, so elegant when used with the ammunition it was designed for, proved inflexible when adapted to different cartridges. This realization came as a significant disappointment. Japanese planners had hoped to quickly produce modified Garands using captured rifles as patterns and Japanese ammunition from existing stocks. The clip problem meant any Japanese Garand would require either developing entirely new en-bloc clips for Japanese ammunition, a major manufacturing challenge, or redesigning the rifle to use a different feeding system entirely. By August 1942, Watanabe's team had documented their findings comprehensively. The technical reports traveled through the Imperial Japanese Navy's command structure, reaching the Navy Ministry in Tokyo, and eventually the desks of senior officers responsible for weapons procurement and infantry doctrine. The conclusions were undeniable and deeply troubling. The United States had achieved a revolution in small arms that the Japanese Empire could not match with existing resources. The M1 Garand represented not just an incremental improvement over bolt-action rifles, but a fundamental transformation in infantry firepower. American soldiers possessed a 3-to-1, sometimes 4-to-1, advantage in sustained rate of fire. This advantage compounded across squad, platoon, and company levels. The Navy's Special Naval Landing Forces, having fought American Marines and Army units across the Pacific, understood these implications viscerally, but understanding the problem and solving it were entirely different challenges. Japan's industrial capacity was already strained to the breaking point. Aircraft production, naval construction, artillery, manufacturing, ammunition production, and basic logistics consumed every available resource. The Army, which controlled most weapons production facilities, showed no interest in semi-automatic rifle development. Army leadership had concluded in 1937 that such weapons were too expensive, too complex, and provided insufficient advantages to justify abandoning proven bolt-action rifles. Combat experience in China had reinforced this view. Chinese forces, armed primarily with bolt-action Mausers, posed no firepower disadvantage. The Arisaka rifles performed admirably, but the Pacific War was different. American industrial might was beginning to manifest in every theater. American forces were not Chinese warlord armies or poorly equipped colonial troops. They possessed modern weapons, unlimited ammunition, air superiority, and growing numerical advantages. The firepower gap would only widen as the war progressed. Navy planners recognized they needed a solution, but implementing one faced enormous obstacles. Japanese arsenals were not equipped for the precision machining required for semi-automatic rifles. The tooling didn't exist. The skilled machinists were already fully employed. Raw materials were increasingly scarce as Allied submarines strangled Japan's supply lines. Even if a viable design could be developed, mass production seemed impossible given existing constraints. These realities meant that for the next 18 months, Japanese infantry would continue fighting with bolt-action rifles while facing American troops armed with Garands. The casualties mounted accordingly. Combat reports from Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Gilbert Islands, and the Marshall Islands all documented the same pattern. Japanese forces attacking American positions suffered devastating losses. The volume of defensive fire exceeded all expectations. Even well-planned assaults with numerical superiority faltered under the weight of American firepower. Lieutenant Hiroshi Takano survived the Guadalcanal campaign with the 2nd Division's Infantry Regiment. His after-action report, filed in February 1943, described a night attack on Henderson Field in October 1942. "We advanced through the jungle in darkness. Our intelligence estimated 2 companies defending the sector. We had battalion strength. The attack began at 0200 hours. The volume of enemy fire was immediate and overwhelming. Every rifle position seemed to fire continuously. We estimated machine gun positions every 10 meters. We later learned the Americans had no machine guns in that sector, only their semi-automatic rifles. Our attack failed with 70% casualties." Similar reports accumulated throughout 1943. Japanese commanders began incorporating the American firepower advantage into their tactical planning. Banzai charges, once considered viable tactics when executed with sufficient numerical superiority and prize, became suicide missions against Garand-equipped defenders. The Americans simply shot down attacking forces before they could close to bayonet range. By late 1943, the strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The United States island-hopping campaign was methodically severing Japan's defensive perimeter. American forces recaptured Guadalcanal. They seized the Gilbert Islands. They landed in the Marshall Islands. Each victory brought American bombers closer to the Japanese home islands. The empire's defensive depth was collapsing. In November 1943, Navy leadership made a fateful decision. The Special Naval Landing Forces, elite paratroopers and amphibious assault troops, would receive priority for any semi-automatic rifles that could be developed. These Rikusentai Marines would form the last line of defense when American forces inevitably approached the home islands. They needed the best weapons available. The Navy issued formal specifications to Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. Develop a semi-automatic rifle compatible with Japanese 7.7mm Arisaka ammunition. The rifle must be reliable, accurate, and manufacturable with available resources. Magazine capacity should equal or exceed the American M1. The rifle should be suitable for paratroop operations, meaning it must be durable enough to withstand airborne insertions. Time was critical. The specifications required delivery of functional prototypes by March 1944, just 4 months away. Full-scale production was to begin by January 1945. The timeline was extraordinarily compressed. American designers had spent more than a decade perfecting the Garand. The Japanese Navy expected comparable results in 12 months. Commander Jiro Hamano received command of the project. Hamano, age 43, had spent 20 years in naval ordnance. He had studied engineering at Tokyo Imperial University. He had worked at Yokosuka since 1928, contributing to various weapons development programs. He understood immediately that the timeline was nearly impossible. Developing an entirely new semi-automatic rifle from scratch would take years. Testing would require extensive iterations. Manufacturing would demand new tooling, new production techniques, new quality control procedures. The only viable approach was to copy an existing, proven design, and the only proven semi-automatic rifle design available was sitting in Yokosuka's weapons testing facility, the M1 Garand. Hamano's team examined the captured rifles again, this time with a different objective. They were no longer simply studying American capabilities. They were reverse engineering a production weapon. Every component had to be analyzed not just for its function, but for its manufacturability, using Japanese materials, Japanese tooling, and Japanese production techniques. The team disassembled 3 separate Garand rifles, comparing components to identify variations in manufacturing tolerances. They created detailed technical drawings of every part. They measured dimensions to hundredths of millimeters. They documented heat treatment requirements. They specified steel alloys. They calculated production sequences. By January 1944, the team had produced a complete set of manufacturing drawings, but they had also identified the en-bloc clip problem again. The American feeding system simply would not work with Japanese ammunition. The cartridge dimensions were incompatible. Redesigning the en-bloc clip would require extensive development and testing. Manufacturing new clips would demand dedicated production facilities. Hamano made the critical decision. They would abandon the en-bloc clip system entirely. Instead, the Japanese version would use a fixed, internal magazine with a 10-round capacity, fed by 2 standard 5-round Arisaka stripper clips. This approach offered multiple advantages. Japanese soldiers were already familiar with stripper clip loading from their Arisaka rifles. Existing stripper clip production could support the new rifle. The magazine capacity would actually exceed the Garand's 8 rounds. The modification required significant engineering work. The Garand's receiver was designed around the en-bloc clip system. Removing it meant redesigning the receiver's internal geometry, adding a magazine well that protruded below the stock, incorporating a follower and spring assembly, and creating a clip guide atop the receiver for loading. In early 1944, Yokosuka's machine shop fabricated 10 experimental rifles. They started with captured Garands, removing the barrels and installing new barrels chambered for 7.7mm Arisaka. They modified the receivers extensively, milling away material to accommodate the new magazine system. They fabricated magazine components from scratch. They created new stocks from Japanese mahogany with distinctive 2-piece construction typical of Japanese military rifles, necessary because large single-piece stocks were difficult to source in timber-scarce Japan. The experimental rifles were ugly. The modifications were crude, but when tested in February 1944, they worked. The rifles fired reliably. The gas system cycled the action smoothly. The magazine feeding proved consistent. Accuracy was acceptable. The 10-round capacity actually exceeded the original Garand. Most importantly, the rifles demonstrated a rate of fire comparable to the American original. A trained shooter could fire 30 to 40 aimed shots per minute, nearly triple the rate achievable with bolt-action Arisakas. The firepower gap could be closed. Commander Hamano submitted his report to Navy leadership in March 1944. The experimental rifles had validated the concept. A Japanese version of the Garand was technically feasible. Production could proceed if adequate resources were allocated. But the report also included sobering assessments of the challenges ahead. Approximately 250 separate components required manufacturing. Many demanded precision machining with tight tolerances. The steel requirements exceeded standard rifle production by 30% due to the more complex receiver and operating mechanism. Heat treatment processes were critical and unforgiving. Quality control would be essential, because even small variations in key components could cause malfunctions. Most critically, production capacity was severely limited. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal was already operating at maximum capacity manufacturing 25mm anti-aircraft cannons, Lewis machine guns, and Vickers machine guns. No dedicated production lines existed for rifle manufacturing. The semi-automatic rifle program would have to proceed as a spare-time activity, utilizing machinery and personnel when they weren't occupied with higher priority weapons production. The Navy approved the program anyway. The strategic situation was too desperate for half measures. The Special Naval Landing Forces needed semi-automatic rifles. Even limited production was better than nothing. The rifle was officially designated the Type 4, marking the Japanese Imperial Year 2604, corresponding to 1944 on the Western calendar. Production began in April 1944 on the 3rd floor of Yokosuka's machine gun plant. A small team of approximately 20 skilled machinists worked during gaps in the anti-aircraft cannon production schedule. They manufactured components whenever equipment became available. Progress was agonizingly slow. The complexity of the Type 4 exceeded even experienced machinists' expectations. The receiver required extensive milling operations. The bolt had to be precisely machined and heat-treated to prevent cracking under the stress of repeated firing. The gas piston demanded careful fitting. The operating rod's cam surfaces needed exact dimensions to properly rotate and unlock the bolt. The trigger mechanism was intricate. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Manufacturing proceeded component by component. By June 1944, the team had produced part sets for approximately 50 rifles, but assembling complete weapons proved difficult. Many components required hand fitting. Tolerances that seemed adequate on paper proved too loose in practice, causing malfunctions. Other tolerances proved too tight, preventing proper assembly without additional machining. The mahogany stocks presented their own challenges. Japanese woodworking techniques differed from American practices. The two-piece stock construction required precise gluing and reinforcement. The buttstock had to be strengthened with metal tangs to prevent splitting under recoil. The forend had to accommodate the operating rod's travel without interference. The tangent rear sight, graduated from 100 to 1200 meters, had to be carefully fitted and calibrated. The front sight, a traditional Japanese barleycorn design with protective wings, required precise soldering to the barrel. The bayonet lug had to accept standard Type 99 bayonets, maintaining compatibility with existing equipment. By August 1944, Yokosuka had assembled approximately 25 complete Type 4 rifles. Testing revealed problems. Some rifles experienced feeding malfunctions when the magazine follower failed to properly present cartridges for chambering. Other rifles suffered from extraction failures when fired cartridge cases stuck in the chamber. Several rifles developed cracks in the operating rod after extended firing. The engineering team diagnosed the issues methodically. The feeding problems stemmed from magazine spring tensions that were too weak. Stronger springs solved the issue. The extraction failures resulted from chamber dimensions that were too tight for the Japanese cartridges, which had slightly different case taper than American 30-06 rounds. Re-reaming chambers to looser specifications eliminated the problem. The operating rod cracks were traced to inadequate heat treatment. Improved tempering processes strengthened the rods. By October 1944, the Type 4 design was reasonably mature. The rifles functioned reliably. Accuracy met military standards. Rate of fire matched expectations. But production remained painfully slow. The machinists at Yokosuka could only work on rifle components when anti-aircraft cannon production schedules allowed gaps. Higher priority weapons consumed most available machine time. The strategic situation continued deteriorating. American forces captured the Mariana Islands in July 1944, bringing B-29 superfortresses within range of the Japanese home islands. The first B-29 raid struck Tokyo on November 24th. The Philippines campaign began in October with landings at Leyte. General Douglas MacArthur fulfilled his promise to return. Japanese defenses crumbled. By January 1945, American forces were poised to invade the Ryukyu Islands. Okinawa, just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, would be the next objective. The final battles were approaching. The Special Naval Landing Forces would soon face their ultimate test, defending Japanese territory against overwhelming American firepower. Yokosuka accelerated Type 4 production as much as limited resources allowed. By March 1945, parts sets for approximately 250 rifles had been manufactured, but many remained unassembled due to a critical shortage of completed stocks. The mahogany required for stocks was increasingly difficult to source. Wood shipments from Southeast Asia had been cut off by Allied naval dominance. Domestic timber supplies were inadequate. Approximately 125 Type 4 rifles were fully assembled by April 1945. They sat in Yokosuka's armory, awaiting distribution to combat units. But the rifles were never officially standardized. They bore no imperial chrysanthemum stamps marking them as property of the emperor. They carried no serial numbers. They were simply marked with assembly numbers indicating production sequence. The lack of standardization reflected the program's experimental nature. These were still technically prototypes, not approved production weapons. Issuing them to combat units required formal acceptance trials, documentation, training programs, and logistical support. None of these processes had been completed. Some historians have suggested that a small number of Type 4 rifles may have been issued to Special Naval Landing Forces units defending Okinawa during the April through June 1945 campaign. No confirmed combat reports mention the rifles specifically. No American forces reported capturing Type 4 rifles during the Okinawa fighting. If any rifles reached combat units, they made no measurable impact on the battle's outcome. The reality was that even if all 125 completed rifles had been issued, they represented a drop in the ocean. Tens of thousands of Japanese troops defended Okinawa. 125 semi-automatic rifles among thousands of bolt-action Arisakas would provide negligible advantage. The Americans landed with overwhelming superiority in numbers, firepower, air support, naval gunfire, artillery, and armored vehicles. A handful of advanced rifles couldn't alter the strategic balance. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. The war was over. American occupation forces entered Japan in late August and early September. Teams from the United States Army Technical Intelligence searched Japanese military installations, documenting equipment, weapons, and technology. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, they discovered the Type 4 rifles stored in the armory. The Americans were surprised. Intelligence agencies had known the Japanese were attempting to develop semi-automatic rifles, but the extent of the Type 4 program had been unknown. Here was tangible evidence that the Japanese had successfully reverse-engineered the M1 Garand, adapted it to Japanese ammunition, and manufactured functioning examples. Approximately 20 Type 4 rifles were confiscated and shipped to the United States for study. Some went to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for technical evaluation. Others were distributed to various military intelligence units. Several eventually reached museums, including the National Firearms Museum, the Springfield Armory Museum, and private collections. The remaining Type 4 rifles at Yokosuka were either destroyed or distributed to Japanese police forces during the occupation. Part sets that were never assembled were likely scrapped. The production tooling was dismantled. The technical drawings were confiscated by American authorities. The few surviving Type 4 rifles are among the rarest military firearms in existence. They represent one of the most interesting might-have-beens of World War II. If Japan had begun the program earlier, if resources had been available for dedicated production, if the strategic situation had allowed time for full-scale manufacturing, the Type 4 might have equipped significant numbers of Japanese troops, but these are counterfactuals. The historical reality was that the Type 4 came too late, in too few numbers, to affect the war's outcome. By the time production began in earnest, Japan's defeat was already inevitable. No rifle, regardless of its capabilities, could have reversed the overwhelming material superiority the United States brought to bear in the Pacific. The story of the Type 4 is ultimately a story about the mathematics of war. The M1 Garand gave American infantry a decisive advantage in rate of fire. This advantage compounded across every engagement, every battle, every campaign. Japanese forces faced American troops who could deliver 3 to 4 times as many aimed shots per minute. The psychological and tactical implications were devastating. Japanese attempts to close this firepower gap through the Type 4 came too late and with insufficient resources. The reverse engineering effort succeeded technically. The rifles worked, but production capacity, resource constraints, and the compressed timeline meant the program could never achieve meaningful impact. The examination of captured Type 4 rifles by American ordnance officers revealed the sophistication of Japanese engineering even under desperate wartime conditions. The rifles demonstrated high-quality workmanship. The machining was precise. The materials were good, considering Japan's resource constraints by late 1944. The modifications to Garand's original design were logical and well executed, but the rifles also revealed the extent of Japan's industrial limitations. Hand-fitting of components indicated insufficient manufacturing precision. Variations between individual rifles suggested inconsistent production processes. The absence of standardization markings reflected the program's incomplete development. These were functional prototypes, not mass production weapons. American analysts noted with particular interest the magazine modification. The Japanese had successfully converted the Garand's en-bloc clip system to a fixed magazine fed by stripper clips. This modification actually improved the design in some respects. The 10-round capacity exceeded the original 8 rounds. Stripper clip feeding was arguably more versatile than en-bloc clips, allowing partial reloading and topping off without ejecting a partially empty clip. But the modification also added complexity and weight. The protruding magazine increased the rifle's profile. The additional magazine components added manufacturing steps. The clip guide atop the receiver required careful machining. From a production standpoint, the Japanese modification made an already complex rifle even more difficult to manufacture. The broader lesson was clear. Semi-automatic rifle technology, while not beyond Japanese capabilities, required industrial infrastructure, skilled labor, and resources that Japan simply didn't possess by 1944. The United States had spent the 1930s building the manufacturing capacity necessary to produce Garands by the tens of thousands. American factories employed sophisticated machine tools, precision measuring equipment, and highly trained machinists. By 1943, multiple American manufacturers were producing M1 Garands. Springfield Armory led production, but Winchester Repeating Arms also manufactured the rifle under license. Total production during the war exceeded 5.4 million rifles. American industry delivered Garands to every branch of the United States military and supplied Allied forces. Japan's industrial base couldn't match this scale even in peacetime. By 1944, American submarines had severed Japan's supply lines. Raw materials were scarce. Skilled workers were in short supply. Factories faced constant disruption from B-29 bombing raids. The infrastructure necessary for mass production simply didn't exist. The Type 4 program represented Japan's best effort to bridge the technological gap. The engineers at Yokosuka succeeded in creating a functional semi-automatic rifle, but they couldn't create the industrial capacity to produce it in meaningful numbers. The 125 rifles, half completed by war's end, were irrelevant against American forces fielding hundreds of thousands of Garands. The mathematics of the firepower advantage can be calculated precisely. In a typical American infantry company of approximately 190 officers and men, approximately 140 carried M1 Garands. These riflemen could collectively fire approximately 6,000 aimed shots per minute. A comparable Japanese infantry company with bolt-action Arisakas could fire approximately 2,000 shots per minute, 3-to-1 advantage to the Americans. This advantage manifested in every infantry engagement. American companies could suppress Japanese positions more effectively. They could respond to enemy fire more quickly. They could break up attacks before they developed momentum. They could support their own attacks with overwhelming covering fire. The casualties reflected this disparity. Japanese infantry units attacking prepared American positions routinely suffered 50 to 70% casualties. The volume of defensive fire was simply too intense to overcome. American forces attacking Japanese positions also suffered casualties, but typically at much lower rates because their superior firepower allowed them to suppress defenders more effectively. The Battle of Peleliu in September through November 1944 illustrated these dynamics clearly. The 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu Island with approximately 17,000 men. Japanese defenders numbered approximately 11,000. The Marines carried M1 Garands, M1 carbines, Browning automatic rifles, and machine guns. The Japanese carried Arisakas, Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns, and Type 92 heavy machine guns. The battle lasted 73 days. Japanese forces fought with fanatical determination from fortified cave positions. American casualties exceeded 10,000, with more than 1,800 killed. But Japanese casualties approached 100%. Virtually the entire garrison was killed. Only a handful survived to surrender. The casualty ratio, despite Japanese defensive advantages and prepared positions, favored the Americans significantly. Superior firepower, combined with air support, naval gunfire, artillery, and armor, allowed American forces to systematically reduce Japanese positions. The Garand played a critical role in infantry engagements where individual riflemen faced Japanese defenders in close combat. Similar patterns repeated at Iwo Jima in February through March 1945 and Okinawa in April through June 1945. American casualties were severe. The Japanese fought with desperate courage. But the outcome was never in doubt. American material superiority, including the firepower advantage provided by the M1 Garand, guaranteed eventual victory regardless of Japanese resistance. The Type 4 rifles sitting in Yokosuka's armory during these battles represented what might have been if circumstances had been different, if Japan had possessed America's industrial capacity, if the war had lasted longer, if resources had been available. But history is written by what actually happened, not by alternative possibilities. The 125 Type 4 rifles were a testament to Japanese engineering skill. They demonstrated that Japanese designers could successfully reverse engineer complex weapons. They proved that Japanese machinists could manufacture sophisticated firearms even under resource constraints. But they also proved that technical competence alone cannot overcome overwhelming material disadvantages. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.